There are hearings where the room gets loud, members interrupt each other, cameras catch dramatic reaction shots, and by the end of the day, nobody remembers anything except the shouting. And then there are hearings like this one. Hearings where the most important thing is not who yelled the loudest, not who landed the cleanest insult, not even who got the best clip for social media. The most important thing is what the room revealed when it stopped pretending to be a hearing and started behaving like a pressure chamber. Because this was supposed to be a discussion about law enforcement priorities, border security, federal investigations, and the Department of Justice under Attorney General Pam Bondi. That is what the gavel said. That is what the committee schedule said. That is what the opening remarks tried to suggest. But inside that room, everyone knew there was another subject sitting there like a live wire under the table. The Epstein files, not the slogan, not the campaign promise, not the cable news shorthand. The files, the names, the redactions, the victims. The people who had waited years for answers. The survivors who had walked into that room expecting, at the absolute minimum, that the federal government would not expose them while protecting the powerful. And that is where the hearing changed. Because once members began asking direct questions about who had been protected, who had been exposed, why victims' identities had appeared in released material, why alleged perpetrators' names had been shielded, and why the Department of Justice seemed more comfortable talking about transparency than demonstrating it, the room stopped operating like a normal oversight hearing. It started operating like a collision. Not just between Republicans and Democrats, not just between Congress and the Justice Department, but between two completely different stories about what the release of the Epstein material was supposed to mean. One story said this administration had done what no one before it had done, released millions of pages, moved faster than any prior Justice Department, and tried to balance disclosure with protecting victims in a legally difficult process. The other story said the government had used the language of transparency while reproducing the oldest pattern in institutional power. Shield the connected, expose the vulnerable, and call it process. That was the real hearing, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the exact moment that became unavoidable. It happened when lawmakers stopped asking broad political questions and started forcing the conversation into a more dangerous place. Specifics, specific names, specific failures, specific victims standing in the room, specific documents, specific contradictions. That is when a hearing becomes hard to control. Because a general defense can survive ideology, it struggles to survive detail. The atmosphere in the room reflected that immediately. Members tried to frame the day before the first serious exchange even began. Supporters of the Attorney General praised the administration's record, praised its handling of immigration enforcement, praised what they described as the end of selective justice, praised the release of documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and repeatedly cast the hearing's criticism as political theater. That framing mattered. It was not accidental. When institutions know they are vulnerable on accountability, they often broaden the battlefield. They talk about the economy, they talk about the border, they talk about crime statistics, they talk about political hypocrisy. They make the story bigger because the specific story is where the danger lives. And the specific story here was brutally simple. If this administration had truly carried out a historic act of transparency on Epstein-related records, why were survivors saying they were harmed by the release? Why were lawmakers holding up examples suggesting that names of victims and identifying information had been left exposed? Why were there allegations that names linked to powerful men had been protected longer? Or more carefully, than the women and girls who had already been trafficked, abused, and silenced once before? That was the center of gravity. Everything else was orbit. The Attorney General opened with the posture of official resolve. She emphasized victim protection. She emphasized resource commitment. She emphasized the scale of review. Hundreds of attorneys, thousands of hours, millions of pages. She invited Congress to inspect the process. She spoke as a career prosecutor. She said the Department of Justice was committed to accountability. She asked anyone with information to come forward and speak to the FBI. On the surface, that is exactly what a Justice Department should say. But hearings do not test whether officials can say the right words. Hearings test whether the words can survive contact with evidence. That is why the most destabilizing moments were not the speeches. They were the moments when the speeches ran into the people standing behind them. At one point, a member turned to the question the room had been moving toward all morning, not the abstract question of whether victims matter. Everybody says victims matter, not the abstract question of whether justice matters. Everybody says justice matters. The real question: would the Attorney General directly acknowledge what survivors in the room said had happened to them because of her department's release of the files? Would she turn to them and apologize? That is a dangerous question in any hearing because it is not primarily legal, it is moral. Legal questions can be delayed, referred, narrowed, redirected, buried in policy language. Moral questions are harder because the audience understands them instantly. Did harm happen or not? Did your department do it or not? Will you face the people affected and say so or not? Once that question entered the room, the hearing shifted from institutional messaging to human exposure, and you could feel the strain immediately. The Attorney General tried to move backward in time, invoking prior administrations, prior attorneys general, prior failures, prior silence. That was politically understandable. It was also revealing. Because when an official responds to a present tense accusation by expanding the frame to include everyone who came before them, what they are really saying is that accountability should be diluted by continuity. Yes, bad things happened before. Yes, other people failed too. Yes, the problem is bigger than me. That may be true, but it is not an answer. And in a hearing room, non-answers create more pressure than direct admissions ever would. The member pressed again. Not about Merrick Garland, not about Bill Barr, not about what happened years ago, about you, about your department, about the survivors in this room. Will you turn and apologize? That did not happen. And from a political perspective, that was one of the most consequential moments of the hearing, because there are hearings where the legal answer matters most, and hearings where the optics matter most. This was one of the rare ones where the legal and optical dimensions fused together. The refusal, evasion, or inability to make that direct gesture did not just look cold, and it reinforced the core accusation that the machinery of release had been designed around managing liability and narrative, not around the dignity of the people most harmed. Then came another layer: specific examples, emails, redactions, names, lists, survivor identities, alleged perpetrators. When lawmakers began displaying examples of released material and contrasting what had been blocked out with what had not, the hearing entered a far more dangerous zone for the Justice Department. Because process became visible. And once process becomes visible, so does priority. A redaction is never just a black mark on a page. A redaction is a decision. Someone decided this line stays hidden. Someone decided that line can be seen. Someone decided this name is protected. Someone decided that name is not. And when you stack enough of those decisions together, a philosophy appears whether the institution admits it or not. That is what members were trying to make visible. Not just that mistakes had occurred, but that the pattern of mistakes appeared to run in one direction. The language from critics of the release was sharp and emotionally loaded. They described the publication of victim-identifying information as inexcusable. They suggested the release had re-traumatized survivors. They argued that the Department of Justice had treated victims as collateral while handling politically sensitive names with caution. Some framed it as incompetence. Others framed it as deliberate. A few went even further and described it as a continuation of the same culture of power protection that had surrounded Epstein from the beginning. The department, through the Attorney General, resisted that characterization. She emphasized the scale of the undertaking. She emphasized the effort made to protect victims. She said names inadvertently released were redacted when brought to the department's attention. She returned again and again to the size of the review. But scale is a double-edged defense. Sometimes it explains why errors happen. Sometimes it magnifies the damage when they do. Because if more than 500 attorneys and reviewers spent thousands of hours reviewing millions of pages, then critics naturally ask the next question: how did this still happen? How did survivors' names appear? How did identifiable information get through? How did the department release material in a way that, according to the people standing in the room, reopened trauma in their own families and communities? The more serious the review process sounded, the less room there was to explain away the result as a casual administrative error. That is what made the hearing so combustible. The official defense sounded professional. The human consequence sounded devastating. Both could not comfortably occupy the same space for long. Then another pattern emerged, one that often reveals far more than the headline exchange: deflection through expansion. When under pressure on Epstein, defenders of the Attorney General repeatedly widened the conversation. Border numbers, crime rates, stock market levels, judicial activism, federal fraud, sanctuary cities, Article 1 judges, FISA abuse, prior investigations, alleged misconduct by prior administrations, the performance of local governments. And this was not random. In congressional hearings, topic expansion is a survival tactic. If your weak point is one subject, move the witness into zones where they are stronger. Let allies burn time on friendlier ground. Let the witness look authoritative again. Let the room's emotional temperature redistribute. And that happened here again and again. Supportive members praised immigration enforcement. They praised anti-fraud efforts. They attacked sanctuary jurisdictions. They accused Democrats of hypocrisy. They apologized to the witness on behalf of the other side. They used their time less to investigate the Justice Department and more to restore the Attorney General's footing. That matters because it tells you what both sides thought the dangerous subject was. Not the economy, not border enforcement, not media criticism. Adi Epstein. More specifically, the contradiction between advertised transparency and apparent selective protection. And then came one of the most revealing features of the hearing, not because it settled anything, but because it exposed the architecture of the conflict. Two completely different uses of the word transparency. For supporters of the Attorney General, transparency meant volume. Millions of pages released, images disclosed, access provided, a law signed, material made public. For critics, transparency meant integrity. Were the right things released? Were the right things redacted? Were survivors protected? Were powerful names insulated? Were leads ignored? Were investigations closed too early? Was the public being shown everything that mattered? Or just everything that could be safely shown while protecting the wrong people? That is a profound divide, because once two sides are using the same word to mean different things, the hearing stops being a debate and becomes a struggle over the definition of reality. One side says, look at how much we disclosed. The other says, look at what your disclosures reveal about who you still protect. One side says, we opened the files. The other says, you opened them in a way that hurt the victims and left the center of power intact. That divide shaped nearly every exchange that followed. When one member asked how many Epstein co-conspirators had actually been indicted, the question was devastating not because it was legally complex, but because it was brutally measurable. How many? Not how much effort, not how many pages, and not how many lawyers. How many actual co-conspirators have been charged? That is the kind of question every institution hates when its preferred defense is procedural rather than outcome-based. Because procedure has language, outcomes have numbers, and numbers are harder to charm. The hearing never really escaped that point. Over and over, members tried to reduce the administration's performance to outcomes rather than rhetoric. How many names were wrongly exposed? How many perpetrators have been charged? How many leads are still open? How many names were redacted? How many resources were spent? How many people were assigned to scrub names? How many times was one politically explosive name mentioned? That last category became especially volatile. There were repeated clashes over references to Donald Trump's appearance in the released material, over how often his name appeared, over whether his name had been specially treated, over whether Congress had received a complete picture, and over whether the department had redacted him in ways inconsistent with public transparency claims. Supporters of the Attorney General treated this line of questioning as partisan obsession. Critics treated it as proof that the hearing had reached the core issue, not just whether files existed, but whether proximity to power changed how those files were handled. This is where hearings often become most revealing. Not when they resolve the question, but when they reveal which question makes everyone most uncomfortable. Here, it was this. Did political sensitivity shape the release of the Epstein files more than victim protection did? The Department of Justice did not accept that premise. Critics kept returning to it. And once that kind of question lodges in a hearing, every evasive answer feeds it. That is exactly what happened. The Attorney General repeatedly resisted yes or no framing. She objected to what she described as games. She insisted on answering in her own way. She redirected to context. She returned to past administrations. She challenged the motives of her questioners. She emphasized the accomplishments of the president. She accused critics of wanting spectacle over substance. Some of that was strategic. Some of it was defensive. Some of it was political instinct. All of it had a cumulative effect. And it made the hearing feel less like a confident accounting and more like a government fighting on two fronts at once, the legal front and the narrative front. That matters because institutions can sometimes win on one and lose on the other. A department can be technically within its procedures and still destroy public trust. A witness can avoid a direct legal trap and still leave the room looking like they protected power over principle. That was one of the defining tensions of the day. And then there were the survivors. They changed the room simply by being there. Not because they spoke at length in the hearing itself, but because they made abstraction impossible. In hearings like this, officials love nouns like process, review, compliance, classification, release, transparency, and ongoing investigation. And survivors make those words feel smaller than they sound, because every bureaucratic noun runs into a body, a family, a private history, a life that was already broken once. When lawmakers said survivors were still waiting to meet with the Department of Justice, that mattered. When they said some families learned of abuse through the release itself, that mattered. When they described the files as revealing nude images, names, contact information, or identities that had been protected for years, that mattered. Not because every assertion was litigated in real time, but because the room was no longer debating a distant archive. It was confronting people who said the archive had reached back into their lives and wounded them again. That is the kind of fact pattern no institution can easily outmessage. And if the hearing had ended there, it would already have been politically brutal. But it did not end there. It kept splitting into two hearings happening at once. In one hearing, Republicans used much of their time to praise the administration, shift to immigration and violent crime, attack sanctuary cities, talk about federal fraud, discuss FISA, describe what they saw as abuse by prior administrations, and portray criticism of Bondi as selective outrage from people who had ignored Epstein under previous leadership. In the other hearing, Democrats kept trying to drag the witness back to a narrower field. Victims, redactions, names, co-conspirators, investigative leads, and what they described as the department's refusal to follow the real spirit of the disclosure law. That split itself tells a story. It tells you which side wanted the day to be about structure and which side wanted it to be about wound. Structure is always safer for institutions. Wound is always more dangerous. Because structure can be debated, wound can be seen. Then came one of the most revealing tactical patterns of the day, the struggle over time itself. Again and again, members tried to force short answers. Again and again, the Attorney General stretched the frame, challenged the premise, or moved into broader political commentary. That is not unusual in Congress. But here it mattered because time control is really narrative control in disguise. If the question is short and the answer is long, the witness can redefine the subject. If the answer is forced short, the member controls the headline. That battle played out constantly. How many co-conspirators indicted? Will you apologize? Is this credible evidence? Why was this released? Were names protected? Was this person investigated? Why was the case closed? Did your department do this? Those are compact questions. The witness tried repeatedly to refuse that compactness. She pushed back on the questioners, accused them of theatrics, broadened the conversation, invoked prior misconduct, emphasized administration-wide achievements, and sometimes turned offensive rather than remaining defensive. Supporters loved that. Critics saw it as proof that the substance could not be answered cleanly. Both reactions are politically predictable. But analytically, the deeper point is this. When a witness under scrutiny spends more energy resisting the form of the question than supplying the content of the answer, and it usually means the content is dangerous. And that brings us to what may have been the most important layer of the hearing, the one that outlasts the shouting and the clips. The credibility question. Not whether every accusation made in that room was true in the strongest legal sense, Not whether every rhetorical flourish was fair, but whether the Department of Justice still looked like an institution that could be trusted to handle politically explosive evidence impartially. That is the real issue beneath the noise. Because the Epstein case is not just about one dead trafficker or one archive of scandal. It is about whether powerful networks are investigated the same way ordinary people are investigated. Whether names attached to money, politics, royalty, media, and influence receive the same treatment everyone else would receive. Whether Congress gets the full truth, whether the public is shown enough to be shocked but not enough to understand. Whether victims are protected as a principle or protected when convenient. Whether institutions expose evil or curate it. That is why this hearing mattered, and it is also why so many members tried to change the subject. Because once you state the issue that clearly, everything becomes more dangerous. If the Justice Department was thorough, why do survivors say they were harmed? If the release was transparent, why do lawmakers keep finding evidence of selective obscurity? If there are no more prosecutable leads, why do some of the materials being discussed look to members like grounds at least for additional inquiry? If no one is being protected, why does the hearing keep producing the same visual contrast? Victims exposed, powerful names disputed, consequences delayed. These are not partisan questions. They become partisan in a hearing room because power is partisan. But structurally, they are questions about whether the state can police itself when the targets are socially or politically radioactive. That is the larger frame. Now step back and look at the choreography of the day. The witness is praised by allies, attacked by critics, shielded by procedural rulings, interrupted by opponents, defended by the chair, and repeatedly offered friendly platforms to recover ground. The critics bring survivors into the frame, display documents and emails, ask narrow questions, force moral language, and emphasize names and omissions. The witness responds by appealing to experience, scale, prior failures, administration-wide success, and political hypocrisy. What emerges is not clarity. What emerges is a map of institutional stress. And one of the most important signs of that stress was the emotional asymmetry in the room. The administration's defenders often sounded energized, combative, indignant, even triumphant. They wanted to turn the hearing into a referendum on the president's broader record. They talked about markets. They talked about border crossings. They talked about fraud. They talked about law and order. They accused the other side of obsession, bad faith, and staged outrage. The critics sounded something different. Not calmer exactly, because several were clearly angry, but more tethered to one narrow argument, that the hearing could not morally move on while survivors were still unprotected and no one of real power had been held accountable. That asymmetry matters because it tells you what each side believed was at stake. For supporters, the hearing threatened the administration's momentum and public image. For critics, the hearing threatened something more foundational: the possibility that once again the system had found a way to let scandals circulate without letting accountability land. Those are very different stakes. One is political damage control, the other is institutional indictment. And that helps explain why the hearing felt so unstable. Because once those two visions collide, normal oversight language stops working. And then there is the question of what the hearing actually established. This is where careful distinction matters. The hearing did not by itself prove every accusation made against every named individual. It did not by itself establish guilt for everyone discussed. It did not by itself litigate every document to finality, but it did establish several things of major public importance. It established that the handling of the Epstein-related material remains deeply contested even after the administration's much-publicized release. It established that survivors and their allies believe the release process itself caused fresh harm. And it established that lawmakers from the opposition are not simply demanding more files, but are specifically alleging that the release process protected powerful men while failing the women and girls the law was supposed to protect. It established that the Department of Justice still has not satisfied those concerns in any way that neutralizes them publicly. And it established that the issue is now much bigger than the files themselves. It is about trust. That may sound abstract, but trust is the real currency of justice. Without it, even a technically lawful process looks contaminated. And contamination spreads. If victims do not trust the release, witnesses do not trust the investigation. If Congress does not trust the release, oversight does not trust the agency. If the public does not trust the release, how do every future disclosure looks managed? If the release appears politically selective, then transparency itself begins to look like another instrument of control. That is the danger the department faced in this hearing. Not just criticism, delegitimization. And hearings like this can accelerate that very quickly because they are not just information events. They are symbolic events. Who sits behind the witness? Who is standing in the room? Who gets interrupted? Who refuses to answer? Who gets protected by the chair? Who gets time to monologue? Who gets reduced to 17 seconds? Who asks for apology? Who does not give one? Who invokes victims? Who invokes markets? Who brings in immigration? Who brings in Minnesota? Who brings in old impeachments? Who brings in the stock market? Who keeps dragging the conversation back to the women standing behind the witness? All of that becomes part of the moral record whether it appears in a formal report or not. And that record was devastatingly complicated for the Justice Department. Because even where the witness sounded strongest on administrative scale, on prosecutorial background, on broad law and order themes, those strengths kept colliding with the same stubborn weakness. Why did this process look, to so many people in that room, like power had still found a way to protect itself? That question survived every pivot. It survived every partisan attack. It survived every appeal to the border. It survived every invocation of prior hypocrisy. It survived every complaint about being interrupted. And that is usually how you know a hearing has landed. The central question does not disappear even after everyone tries to bury it. Now consider the long-term implications. The first is obvious. The political story is not over. Once a hearing produces this much conflict over documents, names, and victim exposure, follow-up demands are inevitable. More letters, more requests, more subpoenas, more hearings, more selective leaks, more public pressure, more cable news framing, more social media warfare, more allies insisting the administration has already been maximally transparent, more critics insisting the real story has not even been touched yet. The second implication is institutional. Every future release by the Department of Justice on politically explosive matters will now be judged through this lens. Was this handled like the Epstein files? Were victims protected? Were the powerful insulated? Is millions of pages being used as a substitute for meaningful accountability? Did the department release so much volume that the public could be overwhelmed without ever getting the answers that matter most? That is a very dangerous template for a Justice Department to carry. The third implication is moral and cultural. The hearing reminded the country that in cases involving sexual exploitation, trafficking, and elite impunity, there is a permanent temptation for institutions to convert people into paperwork. Victims become records. Abuse becomes metadata. A life becomes a redaction decision. A trauma becomes a release protocol. The survivors in that room disrupted that conversion. And once they did, everything sounded different. I had a phrase like, inadvertently released sounds administrative until you imagine a daughter's name, a family finding out, a hidden history blowing open because the state mishandled what it had promised to protect. That is why the hearing lingered. Not because every exchange was eloquent. Not because every member behaved nobly. Not because every claim was cleanly sourced in the moment, but because the hearing made one old truth impossible to ignore. Power does not only protect itself through secrecy. Sometimes it protects itself through selective transparency, by releasing enough to claim virtue while still controlling what kind of truth becomes legible. That is the accusation hanging over this entire episode, and the Attorney General did not clear it. She fought it. She resisted it. She politicized it. She counterattacked. She reframed. She widened. She invoked the administration's achievements. She accused the opposition of bad faith. She insisted on answering her own way, but she did not clear it. If anything, the hearing deepened it. And perhaps that was inevitable. Because once a hearing about the Epstein files includes survivors in the room, visible frustration over direct questions, allegations of victim exposure, unresolved questions about co-conspirators, and repeated attempts to shift attention elsewhere, the public begins to hear something underneath the words. Not certainty, not proof of every charge, but the sound of a system failing the same test again. Will the vulnerable be protected first? Will the powerful be treated the same as everyone else? Will institutions tell the truth when the truth leads upward? And those questions are bigger than one attorney general, bigger than one administration, bigger than one hearing. But hearings are where those questions become visible, and this one made them visible in the harshest possible light. By the end of the session, one fact dominated the emotional memory of the room. Not the stock market references, not the immigration tangents, not the partisan taunts, not the procedural sparring, the survivors, the unanswered apology, the unresolved names, the gap between the promise of transparency and the experience of harm. That is what remained. Because hearings end when the gavel falls, but accountability does not. It either arrives later or it never arrives at all, and that is the real cliff edge this story now sits on. If the administration's defenders are right, then further review will eventually show that what happened was an imperfect but serious effort to open one of the darkest archives in modern public life, while trying, under impossible conditions, to protect victims and comply with the law. But if the critics are right, then what happened in that hearing was something much uglier. It was the public catching the state in the act of repeating the same old hierarchy in a new language. Not silence, but selective disclosure. Not denial, but managed revelation. Not justice, but the appearance of movement wrapped around the preservation of the center. And that is why the hearing mattered far beyond the room. Because the Epstein story has always been about more than one man's crimes. It has been about the social ecosystem that made those crimes survivable for the people around him. And the money, the access, the introductions, the deference, the fear, the delay, the half-investigations, the sealed records, the strange gaps, the names everybody whispers and the names nobody officially touches. The minute a hearing starts to suggest that even the cleanup phase may be replicating some of that logic, the hearing stops being about records management. It becomes a referendum on whether the American justice system can ever truly expose elite wrongdoing without protecting elite structures at the same time. That is the deepest question left behind by this confrontation, and nobody in that room answered it. Not the Attorney General, not her defenders, not her critics. What the hearing provided was not an answer. It provided a sharper version of the question. If the federal government really intended to open the truth, why do so many of the most vulnerable people in the room feel like they were opened instead? That is the line that will outlive the clips. That is the line that will haunt every future filing, every future hearing, every future promise of transparency. Because once the public sees that contradiction, it cannot easily unsee it. A file release is supposed to expose the past. This hearing exposed the present. It exposed how institutions behave when asked to confront evil that touched wealth, influence, politics, status, and celebrity. It exposed how quickly defenders of power will try to move the conversation to safer terrain. It exposed how hard it still is to get a direct answer when the answer might have consequences for people who matter. And it exposed that even after years of outrage, after laws, after promises, after grand declarations of disclosure, the same question still sits in the center of the room unanswered. Who was protected? And who paid the price for that protection? Until that question is answered clearly, specifically, and credibly, no amount of page counts, production numbers, self-praise, or partisan blame-shifting will close this story. Because this story was never really about whether the files existed. It was about whether the truth inside them could survive contact with power. And after this hearing, that is still the one thing nobody can promise.